reflect, what's actually going on in academia, what the science and the statistics show. And it's, part of my passion is, for my patients to take control of their health, for them to feel empowered, to know about their bodies, to know about their mental states, to make good decisions that are based on accurate information, that are not based on coercion, that's not based on Bible thumping, but accurate information that will keep them in good health.
Awesome.
I said yes because it's one of my 3 favorite topics. And so my husband will say all the time, let's talk on sex. Absolutely. One of her favorite topics. She'll say yes to that. So that's why I'm here. One of my favorite things that I'm just really passionate about for a lot of the reasons that Dr. Robinson said.
Awesome. All right. Jason, anything you want to share? Yeah, I think your earbuds may have turned off on you. So, yeah, did they turn off on you? So, what we'll do is we're going to break for a short commercial. We're going to come right back. We're going to jump into the discussion. We're going to give Dr. O'Rourke an opportunity to just tell us a little bit something about himself. And then we're going to jump right into the discussion that we have prepared for this afternoon. By all means, if you've joined us, make sure you put your questions, your comments in the comment box, and we'll be right back.
The Relationship Ministries Department of the Allegheny East Conference is a family of ministries that seeks to engage, enrich, and empower families, men, singles, couples, and parents to have healthy and whole relationships. To access the many resources we have available to you, your church, or your family, visit us on the web at www.visitaec.org/relationshipmin.
All right. Really quickly, what I want us to talk about, or what we're going to start off with is, of course, our subtitle for this discussion is what the church should tell you, but doesn't. All right. So what I want us to talk about first is, what do you think are some of the principal reasons that the church does not discuss sex in a healthy manner? Or what do you think is the impact of avoiding conversations within our sacred spaces about sex? Because the reason we had having this conversation is because a couple of months ago, the Relationship Ministry Department did a broadcast where there was something sexual mentioned, and then it went haywire. And we realized that we don't, as a church, talk well about sex. And so we're going to address it. So why do you think we, don't do it? And what do you think is the impact of avoiding those conversations in the church about sex?
I think at best there is, some benevolence there, that we want to protect our kids from diseases. We want to prevent them from getting unintended pregnancies. We want to protect them from heartbreak. So there is some benevolence there. I think there's also, more often than not, the control that's there. We want to control people's bodies. We want to control their actions. We can't negate the impact of the patriarchy, particularly as it relates to sexual liberation in women, body autonomy. There has been, over the course of Earth's history, control mostly over women's bodies, but control over our sexual experience. So there is some, we do want to do good, but because of the control issues, we don't give comprehensive sex education. So that's part of it.
I'm going to ask you to unpack more of that in a second. Because I think that's a very good, that's a very important thing that we need to sort of address, the male-centric view of healthy sexuality that is promulgated in the church. But anyone else, why do you all think that it's not something that we talk about? And what is the dangers in not talking about it in our sacred spaces?
One of the things I want to share is that I don't think that it's just unique to the church, in that I'm having a hard time identifying any aspect of culture, the church, unchurched, whatever, that actually is having real conversations about sexuality. And I say that because of this. Having conversations about sex, or talking about sex, from a excuse me, from a perspective such as, oh, it feels so good. The whole song that came out recently that was really all up in arms, WAP and whatnot, had everybody up in arms. That's not necessarily talking about sexuality. That is talking about engaging in intercourse. And so there's not a lot of society that actually talks about the full spectrum of human sexuality, about preserving and not just preserving, but caring for your body, understanding your limitations, teaching individuals how to make requests within the sexual relationship, husbands and wives being taught how to engage in conversations. That whole, and I'm just giving a few examples, but I don't want us to walk away saying that if we talk about sex, or at least glorify sexual intercourse, that is actually having a healthy conversation about sexuality and about sex. And I don't see anywhere in our society where we actually are having a healthy conversation about it. That's been my experience.
Yeah, I agree. It's not just the church. It's our society in general that's pretty heavily invested in sexual repression. And we can get to that some more in a moment, but just specifically, I think that the church doesn't really talk about pleasure so much in society. Having sexual pleasure is just not something that's dinner table conversation. And so talking about sexual arousal and sexual desires, if our parents didn't talk to us about it, quite often we pass that same thing down. We don't talk to our children about it. And so oftentimes, I think it's just a generational thing as well. But I think he's right. It's not something that's just in the church. We live in a very sexually repressive society.
But Dr. Knight, that's crazy to me, because how is it that we don't talk about this thing that God created? Like, in the place where the people of God gather, it's almost as if we talk about sex as if it's like some great big secret. Dr. Robinson, I saw you unmute your mic, so I'm ready for you to drop some more knowledge.
There's a fear there. It's not universal, but there's a fear that if we talk about sex, that people are going to start having more of it. And that's, the science does not support that. The science supports, when people have comprehensive education that includes not just abstinence, but also sexual identity, that talks about giving and receiving pleasure, that talks about body anatomy, that talks about contraception, and also, diseases and pregnancy. When it's comprehensive, it's not showing that people are having more sex. More people are having safer sex, but there's a fear that if we're talking about sex, then people are gonna go, start having more of it.
Yeah, Jason, chime in here. Did you work out your mic situation? No. Yeah, we'll get you. We'll get you soon. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, you were asking why is it, like, if it's something that God has created. I think that it is a good idea for us to start to conceptualize this idea of sexual repression in society, but also within the church as a form of injustice. It shows up in a myriad of ways, right? Purity culture, which is mostly told young people, especially young women, and Dr. Robinson kind of hit on this for a moment, right? That sex is simply something that's not to be done. It's not to be pondered. It's something that we should be ashamed of. It's hard to forget those things once you get married, right? Like, you just get married and all of a sudden, poof, 20, 30 years of being told that sex is wrong and just don't do it goes away. And so I think we really need to recognize the injustice of and the disservice we do to people when we don't discuss these things.
And I like the way that Dr. Robinson and Dr. Knight approach it, talking about it from a comprehensive standpoint. And when do you begin having those conversations about sex and sexuality? It actually begins when they're children, when they're toddlers, letting them feel comfortable. I've seen so many parents who they will discourage their children from touching their penis or touching their vagina or anything of that nature. And so, as Dr. Knight just said, there's almost this shaming and I know it's not the words that you use. I'm translating it in my own words, but this whole shaming that goes along with it. But we actually have to begin, and we talk about a comprehensive. It has to begin when they're children, when they do play with their penis or when they do play with their vaginas, helping them to understand this is a part of your body. It has a very specific function. This is what it's for. It even helping them understand it actually may or will become even more sensitive to stimulation and to touch. These are conversations that are very appropriate to have.
Yeah.
And to continue to have those conversations. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I thought you were done. I have some pins that say penis and vagina are not bad words. We need to start teaching children. I mean, you talk about your elbow, right? You talk about your shoulder, your nose, and then we'd entirely skip all of their sexual organs, right? We have to start naming things for what they are. Those things that are not named are always going to be mired in shame. So if you do not name things, if you do not speak about them, if you do not bring these conversations up, of course there's going to be shame about it because you're implicitly telling me there's something wrong with it. There's something bad. It's not okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we in our training, we learn things about ages and stages, and Dr. Davis is absolutely correct. It's age-based education. So at age 2 and 3, we start by teaching them the actual names, the anatomical names. We don't use the PP and the secret place and pocketbook. No, we say vagina, we say penis. As you said, Dr. Knight, you name it, it takes away it demystifies it. It takes away the taboo. When they get a little older, we talk about you should not be keeping any secrets from mommy and daddy. There's nothing that you can say that will make me love you less. There's nothing that you can say about, some sort of secret that will make you get in trouble. In that way, we take away, we reduce some of the risk of these sexual traumas that usually begin in childhood. As they get a little bit older, we talk about consent and, touching your body. And if someone says they don't want you to, approach them or touch them in a certain way, then you don't do that. We talk about consent. Dr. Davis hit about, touching, not necessarily masturbation in children, but certainly the pleasure, the pleasurable feelings that even children can feel from touching their private parts and how that can intensify as they get older. And, saying, okay, certain things are done in private. You don't do this in front of, non-family friends, things like that. This is something that you do in your room in private. And as you get older, the education becomes a little bit, more sophisticated, but it's always age-based. And it's exactly right. We start when they are 2 and 3 years old.
And just last week, we had a conversation on racialized trauma. And one thing that we get from traumatic experiences that are passed down to us is also this idea or this mentality about sexuality. And so even if you trace back how women were objectified in slavery, or men were emasculated in slavery, where we were taught historically through, a race-based trauma to hide our sexuality, where our parents would say, oh, well, if you're developing too fast, well, we don't want someone to see you, so that then, you're now placed in danger. And so a lot of it has also been passed down to us through our stories and our traditions, which then develops this repressive amount of trauma that we get around sexuality. And so I don't know if you all have seen any of that or have encountered any of that, but that's the importance of why the church then has to speak about it. Why? Because then some of our parents were uncomfortable. I won't tell you all what I told my daughter about sex parts. Luckily, she has a mother, okay, that talks to Dr. Robinson, because I told her absolutely the wrong thing. She just found out I don't have a vagina like her, because I didn't know what to say. I was caught off guard at 2. I can't answer that question. So anyway, I need help. But for some reason, the church, we need to talk about it because God created it. And if you don't talk about it in the context of where it was created, people get a misnomer about it. And then they start to believe what the streets are saying. Yeah, Jason, if you got it going, man, I'd love to hear you, man.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I'm even going to put you solo.
Praise
shot,
the
man.
Lord. All right. I'm gonna speak from my family situation. The amount of trauma that happened in my family, my parents coming to the church, and what they experienced prior to church influences how they view it in the context of church. So like my father does not have a conversation with me until I'm much older and I already know everything. And this is, of course, after I got molested by a church member, right? And so the most that they can say in the church, most people say in the church, and I believe this genuinely, they say don't do it because of their previous experience with it. That's what people in my family got molested, people in my family got raped. And so it's a bad thing until it's the time. And now you have to somehow switch your mind into saying it's time now, but you've practiced so long for it to be a bad thing that now that you're in the time when it's supposed to be activated, there's a whole lot of fear, a whole lot of concern, a whole lot of I'm having a bad. You don't feel good about yourself, low self-esteem, self-confidence. All of these things are happening because the shame blanket that we experienced from the beginning has never been lifted. And if you're talking about African American people, diaspora, etc., you're looking at shame. You have compound trauma, you have compound guilt, compound grief, you have compound shame. Yeah, shame upon shame upon shame around this topic, right? And when you don't deal with that, that's an existential problem. Guilt is a behavior problem. Shame is an existential problem. So now people across the board, male and female, struggle with the existential tension of, I have these urges. And I very rarely, and maybe one of you all can correct me, but I very rarely hear anybody say that the urges are good. I very rarely hear it. The urges are good. They're God designed. Your bodily reactions are God designed. Let's just say that. Bodily responses to someone you find attractive are God designed.
We absolutely don't say that. We absolutely don't say that. Our focus is suppress it. It's of the devil. It's a demonic spirit that needs to be repressed, exorcised, beat out, prayed away. You're right.
Yeah, I'm so glad. Yeah, I'm so glad he brought that up because, when we talk about sexual pleasure and sexual arousal, sexual desires, even none of these things are inherently bad. We have to teach our children that from the time they're young, we need to teach them that, right? Being hungry is not bad. Being thirsty is not bad. Being sexually aroused is not bad. What we do when we're hungry matters, right? It matters if you always satisfy your hunger with a burger and fries or pizza versus salad. What we do, right, when we're thirsty matters. It matters if you fill your belly with a bunch of sugary sodas, right? But what we do when we're sexually aroused, that's what matters. It's not that the arousal itself is bad. Those are good things. Your body is working, and that is a good thing.
Listen, that's very powerful. So can you all explain to me what a healthy sexuality actually is? Like when we talk about healthy sexuality, what is that?
Can I start?
Yeah, sure.
Now, I have come to this position. I was always taught that we are sexual beings. And for me, recently I found that confusing because sexuality revolves in many cases around doing or the behaviors or the expressions, et cetera, et cetera. And what I have kind of come to be comfortable with is that I'm an intimate being that can express it sexually when I so choose, right? Sexuality is part of my intimate being. And so for me, because I used to try and use sexuality to get to intimacy, and that doesn't work, right? Intimacy being known and being fully known. I can know you on the outside, but I don't know you, and I want it to be known. So the idea of being an intimate being and being known, fully accepted, vulnerable, transparent, all of those are the backdrop for me to a healthy sexual life, right? And because I'm going beyond behavior, if I can say that. I'm going beyond the actions of sexual intimacy to the being. Because here's the deal. If all of a sudden I get in a wreck with my wife, if I'm a sexual being, if I can no longer be sexual with my wife, what does that say about my being? But if I'm an intimate being that can just no longer behave in a sexual way, My being is fine. My behavior has been altered. So that's kind of where I split it. That's where I'm at.
It was the devil making your volume turn off, man. That's some good stuff, man. Anyone else? What is a healthy sexuality?
I think it's a few things. I think that it's a combination of body autonomy. I think it's the respect and adherence to concepts of consent. It's behaviors that's free from coercion, that's free from guilt and shame. It's detached, something that's detached from one's value. You're not placing someone's value into how much or how little sex that they've had. It's open communication with your partner or partners, and feeling empowered not just to give pleasure, but also to demand that you receive pleasure in equal measure.
Yeah, and I think that it also includes being educated. So being educated, not just about sex in general, but knowing your own body, knowing your turn-ons and your turn-offs and what kind of things excite you. All of that is included in a healthy sexuality.
Explain that some more to me, Dr. Knight. I know you got more. I could sense it.
Well, earlier, Dr. Robinson actually mentioned, about children exploring themselves, right? It's a normal, natural thing. And so she said not necessarily masturbation. It doesn't matter what term you put on it. The American Academy of Pediatrics has already told us that that it is developmentally normal for a child to explore their bodies. We call it masturbation. Doesn't matter what you want to call it, right? So am I saying get off of here and go masturbate? No, that's not what I'm saying. You ought to be praying. You ought to be taking every action that you have to the Lord, right? But I am telling you that just like crawling and then creeping and then walking, most people crawl first and then they creep and then they walk. Are there some people out there who just went straight from, scooting around and stood up and walked one day? Absolutely. Are there some people out there who have never masturbated? Absolutely. But is it a developmentally normal thing as far as this is just the normal thing as far as exploring your body? That is developmentally normal. And what we do as a church and what we do as a society is we shame people for having these developmentally normal experiences. So now you have an entire area of your life that we're telling you to keep silent on. We're telling you to allow it to just grow in the dark. And anything that grows in the dark, I don't care how healthy it was going to be, it will no longer be healthy. So as long as you keep hiding your sexuality and your sexual desires and your sexual proclivities, all of the things that come up and we tell you be quiet about it, don't talk about it because it's not a safe space, it will grow in the dark and it will grow into something that's not good. The only thing that grows well in the dark is in a petri dish, and that's not good for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we teach people when they come into our offices, Dr. Knight, with anxiety or with trauma. You can't keep holding on to it yourselves. Anything you keep if you wear it on your sleeve and expose it to the light, you can deal with it. If you keep it inside, it's going to grow. It's going to haunt you. And so even that the repressive sexual trauma that a lot of people experience is because many of our conversations with our parents, if it was like mine, don't do it. That's the totality of your conversation about sex. And so what happens when you tell someone not to eat the cookie in the cookie jar? They're like, well, why are you telling me not to eat it? That cookie must be rather tasty. And they go, anyway, let me not get fired. Rob, I see something brewing, man.
Yeah, when we talk about a healthy sexual identity, we have to think about it within the context of just a healthy identity, period. And so too often, and this is what I was getting at a little while ago, too often we compartmentalize and we say, okay, this is the sexuality part, this is our emotional part, our spirituality part, etc. We are a total whole human being. And so we can't compartmentalize these different areas of our lives. And and especially in America, in an American society, we've done so well at two things: compartmentalizing the different aspects of our lives so that we're one person at work and we're another person at home. We're one person at church, another person in our community, rather than being our true selves. And so when it comes to sexuality, we have to, a healthy sexuality is developed when I am a healthy human being, a healthy functioning human being, period. If I have issues, for lack of a better term, unresolved issues, it's going to be very challenging to have a healthy sex life if I have challenges and emotional baggage and hangups in other areas of my life that may not be related, quote unquote, to intercourse or to sexuality, but if I haven't learned how to communicate well, that's going to have a direct impact on sexuality. If I haven't learned about forgiveness, then that's going to have a direct impact on my sexuality. If I haven't learned how to be honest and to say, these are the principles that I live by, this is what I would like to do. You can have your own and we can continue to be in relationship, but this is who I am. If I haven't learned to master those skills, then I'm going to have a difficult time just saying, okay, well, I want to be Don Juan and just be, the top level, or Casanova, the top level the world has ever seen. It doesn't really work like that. True sexuality is when we actually are healthy, emotional beings in every aspect of our existence.
Gotcha. So really quick, I know that we're going to take questions soon, but are there any discrepancies that you all know between the male and female views of sex, and are we wired differently biologically or psychologically in terms of our desire points? I'm going to throw this to you first, Dr. Robinson, so you can tell us the physiology of it all, and then we'll throw it to Dr. Knight next for the psychology of it all, and then we'll throw it to Dr. O'Rourke for the whatever. Yes, you get the point.
Okay, so the first part of your question about differences in how we treat sex, men and women, we treat it differently. For men, it's clout. The more they have, the higher currency they have to trade. Women often want a man. I'm just telling you how it is. Women often want a man who is experienced sexually, and it's the opposite for women. For women, sex is seen more like pie or cake. You get a certain amount, and then once you start giving away those slices, ultimately, when you find the one, or when you're finally with your partner, you've got nothing left to give because you've given it away. That's the perception on how it's differently. A lot of men prefer women who are not sexually experienced. They want to be the first. They want someone who's pure. They want someone who's untouched. And those ideologies have to change. Now, in terms of the physiology, the studies show that desire is similar among men and women. But in terms of, the excitement, arousal phase, it's more physiologic for men. All they have to do is get a hard on. For women, for lubrication, excitement, arousal, it's much more psychological. They have to, oftentimes, and it's not a hard and fast rule, but oftentimes, the dishes have to be clean, the bills have to be paid, the children have to be, well behaved or asleep. They have to not be thinking about work stress or money stress, or am I fat stress, things like that. There's a mindset that's different. So while the desire is similar across the board, getting to the point of sexual intercourse, arousal, excitement tends to vary greatly between men and women.
You want to repeat whatever question you still have? Because that was a really good description.
Yeah, we were just talking about the differences between the male and female views of sex and sort of the biological or psychological differences. But Dr. Robinson just dropped the mic on us. So
Absolutely.
Next caller, please.
One of the things, though, that she brought up that I think is really important for us to pay attention to is this idea of purity for women, right? This idea that you only have so much and only so much can go around. And that is very rooted and grounded in purity culture. I like to call it the idolatry of purity culture, right? Because we've placed on this pedestal this ideal that's almost impossible, because honestly, men, they might want a woman who's quote unquote pure, but somehow they also want her to be experienced to some degree. They want her to be able to shake it and all this kind of stuff, right? And so we're being held to an ideal that's impossible, and somehow being held also to this standard of, oh, but you're also causing these men to have these desires, right? By being a temptress or seductress in some way, right? So sexual health also needs to really take into account accountability. It really needs to take into account ownership of our own, right? Personal responsibility responsibility for our own desires and not placing that on somebody else. All of those things become really important when we're talking about like our sexual health and how we view men and women differently.
There was a study that I read that showed, I don't know if you all, I won't call out the exact program, but I'm sure you all know these virginity pledges that we have teenagers make. There are a few programs, and there was a study that looked at a few of them, and the results were that I think there were 8 out of 10. Yeah, I think there were 8 out of 10 of teenagers who took this pledge, a virginity pledge, abstinence until marriage, did not stay abstinent. 8 out of 10 who took this pledge broke the pledge. And not only that, they had higher rates of having unprotected sex and not seeking care and not seeking STD screenings or preventions. And that it's opposite than, teenagers who never took the pledge, having higher rates of getting regular care, seeking STD prevention, having a better comprehensive understanding of sex education. So there you go. That's true.
And from a psychological perspective, I can almost guarantee you they also had higher rates of shame. I guarantee you, right? Because those things are very highly correlated with all of the other things that you're talking about.
And it's not, we don't really promote abstinence and purity pledges among men. We do it among women. And I think a lot of the problems that we have with the patriarchal communication about sex in the church is tied to male ego fragility. In that, yes, we don't want a woman with lots of experience because that taps into, okay, well, the male ego. And so those of us, and of course the church has been led so long by men, which probably is why it's in the condition it's in, but it's been led so long by men that idea or that mindset has been pushed so often on young girls and young women, in that you have men who have been conditioned to be sexually expressive and women who've been conditioned to be sexually repressive. And so they get into these marital relationships, and women see themselves as not being able to be an aggressor, or I just better wait to be pursued. That's kind of foolishness. How do you all think we get out of those things?
Well, let me throw something here that and you just kind of hit on it, and you've heard me use this before, Dr. Defoe, and that is pre-programmed. We come into this world. And one of the things that whenever I'm doing any type of presentation on racial biases and stuff, I'm always the first to acknowledge sexist. And I tell people that I'm a sexist because I was born in 1974. I was born in Washington, D.C., and I was born in the United States of America. So you cannot be born in 1974 in Washington, in America, and not be a sexist. Doesn't mean you're an evil person. It doesn't mean, but all of the TV shows, everything that was out there conditioned and began to write on my psychological computer, this is how women are supposed to be treated. This is their role. This is their function. And it wasn't good. It was not constructive and healthy. It was that women were supposed to be there to satisfy the desires of a man, that women are just not as intelligent or competent as men. These are the things that were pre-programmed into my psyche. And so one of the things that will really help us as we begin to talk about transitioning into a healthier sexuality is actually figuring out what has been pre-programmed. Some of the pre-programming has taken place through trauma. Some of it has been taking place through education. Some of it has taken place through ignorance, things that we were not exposed to. But I would really challenge everyone who's listening to this to really just write out what has been pre-programmed into my mind about sexuality. And it's not something I'm going to do just by sitting down once, but right. Maybe just say I'm going to do 10 at a time, 10 things that I was taught about sexuality. And you may say, I don't believe those things. But you'll be surprised that once you're taught something long enough, you claim that you don't believe it, and yet you still actually are acting upon it in the face of saying, I don't believe it. So I want to give an exercise to everyone who's watching, and that is to actually write out what has been pre-programmed into my sexual computer.
I love it. I love it. I think that that's something that we have to realize. It's not, am I biased? It's how biased am I? And in what direction am I biased? In what direction am I already making some decisions based on those biases that I have, right? And so that's why, again, remember I was saying that when we talk about sexuality and sexual repression in the church especially, right, we have to look at it as a matter of justice. We have to look at it as a matter of, right, because when we're looking at it as a matter of just an individual thing, we're not really paying attention to the systemic fact that we're passing on these messages over and over, and that these are the prevalent messages in society, right? So if the church is going to be a unit or a place where we can seek justice and where we can actually have equality for women, right? Then there's no pathway to equality for women that bypasses women's pleasure. There's no pathway for equality to women, right? That somehow bypasses, women's sexuality and the fact that they're being very much disproportionately impacted by these purity culture messages, right? This idea that you have pie and you give it away. Elizabeth Smart, if you guys remember that young lady who was kidnapped, right? She said that the reason she did not leave her captors, if you remember her captors, that she was found like a few exits away from her home, right? She did not leave her captors because she had a teacher who taught her that once she has sex with someone, she's like chewed gum. That is a prominent message in purity culture. And once somebody chews gum, you don't want chewed gum, right? And so this idea that we're telling people that once you've had sex, somehow you are no longer good enough. So now they have based their worth, not in Christ, not on what he did on the cross, but on whether or not they've performed a certain action. Right. And so that's why we have to look at it as a matter of justice, because that is what's happening right now is injustice, for us to not teach people and to not help them understand the grace of God and not understand their own bodies and their desires is an injustice.
You better preach, man. You better preach.
Sister.
Yeah.
Shoot.
Yeah, go on, Jason.
I want to say it this way, and I'll be very brief. If you, from a Bible standpoint, if you look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 5, the Bible says that the image of God is male and female. And then Genesis 5, verse 1 and 2, the Bible says that God blessed them and called their name Adam. So they're Adam, not just him. That's important because they're mutually equal and complementary. And by complementary, I'm speaking of physiology and things. I'm not talking about anything else other than that. So you look at Genesis 2 and God says, listen, I'm going to put you to sleep because you just realize that you're alone. And so I'm going to take half of you and form it over here, which is good because, and this is where life turned left for me. If you're left to choose what you think you like, and you don't know what it is that's going to bring God glory, you might choose a dog or a donkey. So I'm going to put you to sleep, and then I'm going to form this woman over here and bring her to you, and you guys will see each other as I introduce you. And then when you see each other, here's the intimacy. They are now, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And then God says, she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. The beautiful thing about all of that is the mutuality in the story. The mutuality in the story and the mutual equality in the story is phenomenal. He doesn't name her. He doesn't say she's a woman. No, that's God talking. It's called the divine passive. It's not, the man did not give her her identity. God did. That's fact. And God is the one that says they shall leave and cleave. That's what God did. Then, so with that in mind, that is Genesis. Dr. Richard Davidson, has written a tome, literally, it's 800 some odd pages, called The Flame of Yahweh. And it is sexuality in the Old Testament. And he covers everything, literally. And one of the things that he did, and I learned, he showed us this in his class, I thought it was phenomenal, is he demonstrated how, apart from Sabbath, which is a kind of a pause reminding us of Eden, lost and restored, is the Song of Solomon, which is a pause again, hear me well, it is the Bible's erotic literature in the middle of Scripture, written by Solomon in the voice of his wife, right? Erotic literature that is described thematically as a pause that harkens to Eden relationships lost, and Eden's relationship restored. And when you read this scripture, it is very poetic and beautiful and descriptive simultaneously. You couldn't read this book unless you had already memorized so many other books of the Bible. Like, you weren't allowed to read it. That's how serious the Jews took this topic, right? In the Bible, they're very descriptive. They're not crass, and you can tell once the Hebrews get to a certain part of the anatomy, they stop telling you what they're talking about. They just get descriptive. But it's phenomenal. I'm speaking to Dr. D's point of the equality in the Bible. At the end of Song of Solomon, she says this: "Set me as a seal upon your arm, as a seal upon your heart." That's her talking. Then the divine passive comes in, and it says, "For her anger is as cruel as the grave," and a whole bunch of other stuff. And God is speaking, and he says, "Her anger is as fiery flames, the flame of Yah." God likens the woman's passion for her husband as the Shekinah glory in the wilderness. So when we are trying to talk about equality, okay, from an equality standpoint, from sexual health, marital equality, etc., right? Before you jump to Ephesians, read Song of Solomon. Ephesians is dealing with a different construct in the Roman culture. That's a different conversation. But Song of Solomon is talking to Hebrews. And a Jewish man was not, help me, Holy Ghost, the Jewish man was not allowed to climax before his wife.
Oh, come on. What a society.
He was not allowed.
Glory to God.
He was considered a selfish man if he climaxed before his wife.
There's an African culture right now that focuses on that, and so I'm so glad you brought that up. I didn't know that about Jewish culture, but there's a culture that actually focuses on that. I'm gonna have to look that up.
But again, because of there was something in that culture, the Hebrew culture, that despite the patriarchy that we see, which is evident, despite the patriarchy that we see, the Song of Solomon is not about. I mean, that woman's walking around like, yo, I am fly and what? You can't tell me nothing, and I'm darker than all of y'all. But she was very comfortable with herself. And when you read Chronicles, if you read Chronicles, it says Solomon got married, and then it goes on, it says he had wives and concubines. But there's a 20-year time span where he is solely monogamous with the Shunammite woman. 20 years. In which this entire Song of Solomon thing takes place. And he speaks in there as well. He does, but the story is about her. So to Dr. Knight's point, listen, if we don't start teaching this thing adequately, and I strongly advocate for Genesis 1 and 2, Song of Solomon, absolutely. Like, if we don't start teaching teenagers to read the Song of Solomon as God ordained erotic poetry descriptive of what sexuality is supposed to be in a mutually pleasurable relationship as God designed it. Yes. They will forever go off the rails because the descriptors that we are getting is from a pornified culture. And when porn informs your sexual education, you think this thing is supposed to be as intense as it is, as gymnastically as it is. You may not be a gymnast. That may not be your thing. You understand? That may not be your thing. But it doesn't mean you can't have a good sex life. But if porn is informing, there's no intimacy in porn. There's no relationship. There's no connection. It's strictly physical. Now let me end on this point. I crossed the line here, David. I apologize.
Oh no.
But
no.
Let me say this though, because our people need to understand. According to passages, according to 1 Corinthians 6, the Bible says anyone that fornicates sins against their body. We haven't told them why. And that is because the way that the body is designed, once you press the button, it operates on its own. Once you get to a certain point, you're gone, right? It's designed to be, that's how the way that God designed it, right? You can stop things up to a certain point, but at some point it's supposed to be, it's a law. Paul says in Romans 7, I see a law in my members. Think about this. the way that God designed this thing, I'm supposed to physically respond to my wife. It is a creation physiological law. And instead of teaching people, listen to this, instead of teaching people to accept and understand that it is a law that is to be activated at a specific time. Song of Solomon, woman says, do not wake up my love before his time. That's what she's saying, right? Daughters of Jerusalem, don't activate him before his time, right? Instead of teaching people, this is a law that God designed to be enjoyed. And it's not we teach them, watch this, in order to keep the law of God, they must break the law of God. Now you talk about a split personality immediately. You're telling me that what I'm feeling, that's a natural physiological response to arousal, makes God upset? No, and that I should not acknowledge it and manage it. I should deny it. I'm telling people that they must break a law to keep a law.
Mercy.
That is crazy. That is literally crazy. And we have people trying to break one law to keep another law. And this law is physiological. So instead of doing like what Dr. Robinson said and in Dr. Knight, teaching these people, teaching us healthy, teaching us boundaries and understanding our bodies, and okay, that's a normal reaction, baby. That's not a problem. You're not an evil person. That's teaching people how the law works. We teach them that the law is evil.
Mercy.
That's crazy.
And
we have to start teaching ourselves that what it is that God has created in us is healthy, moral, righteous, right. It is good. And as sentient beings, we must operate from here. We must operate from here in the governance of ourselves until the point that we are in a safe relationship to engage. We must acknowledge it, accept it, embrace it, appreciate it, and yet, when is it time for this to be engaged? That is the best question. Not that it's evil, but when is the time? I rest.
Listen, man, that was awesome. Listen. So each one of you all were chosen for your expertise to come on here, and we already have people calling for part 2. The hour is already up, and so we got to take questions from our audience. So if you're watching, shoot your questions into the comment box. We'll take some of your questions. I don't like to take people into overtime because we don't pay overtime. So we got to make sure that we get some of the questions that we got in. But this was so powerful. We need a part 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all of this. And I think that you all have set some people free. And so I don't know how many marriage retreats I've gone on where people have asked me, well, Pastor, is it wrong to have sex on the Sabbath?
Mercy.
Understanding sex in its right, proper context. How could you approach a
How
Sabbath?
could you not have sex on the Sabbath? Come on, Jesus.
It's almost like an affront to God.
Drink
Like,
your
why
water.
are you worshiping
Drink your
on the
water, Dr. O'Rourke.
My favorite answer to that question is that your pastor probably wants you to have sex on the Sabbath before you come to church, so you don't come with an attitude, acting mean, being rude in the parking lot, fighting over parking spaces. You let all that stuff go when you've had a good time. So.
Man, this was powerful. All right, so if you have questions, let's go. If you have questions, drop them in the question box about our discussion, and then our panelists will address them as soon as they come in. This is the last pre-planned question that I want us to sort of wrestle with. Are there sexual acts? And this comes from my wife. She told me to act. No, it didn't come from her. Never mind. I won't throw her on the bus. Are there sexual acts, actions, items that do not have a place in Christian sexual relationships? So someone also added that saying, never mind, go on.
My answer to that is anything that is going to somehow diminish the image of God in your spouse, you probably should not be doing, because I don't want anything that's just the line that I draw. So anything that is disparaging to you, and sometimes that looks different for different people, but I encourage people to ask yourself why, right? So for some people, they feel like oral sex is wrong. Okay, ask yourself why. I'm not telling you that it's wrong or that it's right. I want you to enjoy yourself freely in your marriage, but I want you to ask yourself why, right? I want you to ask yourself why you think certain things are wrong or not okay, or that it might be disparaging, right? That, like, ask yourself these questions. Don't just have an opinion and say, oh, well, this is wrong and we're not going to do it and we're not going to engage in it. See if it's something that is okay with your spouse, right? But if it's something your spouse is not okay with, that's something that doesn't have a place in your marriage.
That's right. Anything that's coerced, anything that's unwelcome, anything dealing with children or animals, these are not things that are okay in any sexual encounter, married or otherwise.
All right.
I defer to the docs.
Yeah. So here's one of our questions. Someone told me that oral sex is a sin. Thoughts?
It's in Song of Solomon.
What do you mean?
Yes,
Please explain
no.
on that. Explain what you mean by that, Jason.
Well, in the Song of Solomon, so if you read the Bible, Song of Solomon, the Bible describes, your breasts are like two deer rounding, and your neck and your temples, and they do all this description, and then you get to this description of the garden. They don't tell you what they're talking about. They don't tell you what they're talking about, right? They just don't. But what she does say is that my beloved feeds among the lilies.
Oh, makes sense when you break it up like that, Jason.
That's what it does say. They don't describe the lower, they don't. So in Deuteronomy, they'll call a man, they'll say his stones. In Isaiah, it'll say, describing of the fallen Israel, lifting up the skirt past the knee, past the thigh, revealing the waters, right? That's the way that is described in Isaiah or Jeremiah. And they do not directly address the genitals. Okay. And in Song of Solomon, she's very clear. I'm a garden. That's what she says. In another place, when they on the marriage night, she Solomon is speaking, and he's describing her. He's like, and your lips are this. And then it's almost as if he can't talk anymore. And she picks up the voice and she says, yes. And they go down on the straightness. In the Hebrew, it says straightness. In the King James, it does not say that. But she's describing what she's going to do to him. So it's in the Song of Solomon. And the Bible in that passage says.
I learned something today.
Oh, in the Bible, after that, you hear God say, drink, my friends. That's the voice of God. It says, drink, my friends, and be drunk, right? He's talking to the marriage couple to get drunk on their intimacy with each other. That's what he's saying. So there is no condemnation in the Bible on that point.
Awesome.
And one of the things that we have to do is there has to be open, honest communication within the sexual relationship. And that's why it goes back to what I was saying a moment ago about we cannot look at this thing in isolation, but we have to have these conversations to talk about what are the things that I find pleasurable, what are the things that I find unacceptable, and to have an honest conversation about why is this unacceptable? What was it? What is it about this particular act that that causes me to be uncomfortable? Some people, no holds barred, as we used to say when I was coming up. The no cut cards. Well, everything's acceptable. They feel comfortable with that. Some individuals have a limited amount of sexual acts that they feel comfortable with. But as we talk, as couples engage in intercourse, there has to be the communication. And I know that is it's kind of backwards to think that you would have conversations about sexuality, but that's actually what has to take place so that you can understand each other, to really get a true sense of what the other person likes and doesn't like, what helps them to climax sooner, all those different things. The more you understand your spouse, your partner, the more you can be in tune with with what they need and with what satisfies them.
Mhm.
So I'll leave it there.
So I think we have some questions coming in from some of our singles that are asking about their sexuality as well. This one is actually addressed to you, Dr. O'Rourke. Dr. O'Rourke, can you elaborate on how a single person manages their natural desires? I understand what you were saying, but maybe not practically.
Okay, I'll do the best that I can to answer this. And the reason why I say that is because Mr. McWilliams, or that's naming out to be a Mr. You have a Mr. for your picture, but that's fine. Everybody is going to manage themselves differently, right? Everybody's going to manage themselves differently. Now, based on what I have studied, and I'm not the sole authority, particularly in the area of addiction, right? The addictive urge. The addictive urge stereotypically lasts about 30 minutes. So if you're in that urge cycle, normally the urge is about 30 minutes. Okay? So within that, acknowledging who I am. If I'm single Jason, you know, if I had to go back and do it again, what do? I know there's a few things that I can do to take this energy that I'm having, and I either need to redirect it, I need to distract myself, but you don't sit on it like, I will not. No, that's not healthy, because you will. You may not today, but you're sitting on it and you're a volcano. And then you will blow up over here at some point in time, either by yourself or with somebody. It's better if you acknowledge what you're feeling, deal with the emotion, understand what triggered you, and figure out how you're going to take that energy and redirect it somewhere else. That is what nobody told me. That is what nobody told me. And that is what I am learning to teach my children at an age appropriate level. You have some energy. Okay, cool. We acknowledge it. It's not bad energy. We just don't want to act in that way right now. Let's redirect it, distract yourself, find out what triggers you. These are all basic principles. You can even use this on the anger cycle. The anger thing is basically the same thing. You know, you have to really work to stay angry for a long period of time. So you're angry, I'm angry, and I'm going to, okay, great. What are you going to do with it? If you're not going to beat the person, what are you going to do with it? And you do the same. What triggered you, acknowledge your feelings, how you're going to distract yourself, how you're going to redirect your energy until you can address it in a healthy way. Those are just the 4 basic principles that I apply in my life, and I'm learning to teach my children.
You also want to be smart and be safe. This is 2020, and singles are not staying abstinent until marriage. So you want to know how to wear a condom. You want to know about birth control, whether it's the daily birth control, whether it's long-acting reversible contraceptions, IUDs, Nexplanons that go in the arm, something where you don't have to think about birth control every day. You need to talk about consent. You should be in a position where if you have the consequences of sex, are you able to deal with those consequences responsibly? High schoolers are not able to deal with those consequences responsibly. They don't have jobs. They're not, finished with their education. So they should delay sex. If you are a single adult with a job, with a 401k, with good health insurance, then you may be able to have the consequences of having sex. So, if you are going to engage, you want to make sure that you're doing it safely, doing it smartly.
Yeah, I think having a discussion about choices is so important with this. And that really feeds into the whole consent thing as well. I know a lot of parents who say they would not, help their teenage child who has said, yes, I'm going to be having sex. I am not waiting till marriage. They would not let them go get contraceptives. And I'm just like, but they're telling you that this is going to happen. And as adults, they're not going to be prepared for the choices that they have available to them. So if we take choice from somebody, the normal, natural thing is to want to take that choice back. Instead of telling people just don't do it, telling people that they have these choices, but listen, this is the wisest choice. It's not a matter of right and wrong. It's a matter of what's the wisest thing in this situation and what is it you believe God is calling you to, as opposed to just taking choices from people.
Dr. Knight, can you run through this one for me real quick? How can you make sex safe for those who have been sexually assaulted or raped? Very important conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so communication is going to be very important. I always recommend having therapy, right? It's very difficult to get over sexual trauma without therapy. Are there people who have done it? Probably so, but it's very difficult. And when we say get over, you got to define what getting over looks like, right? But honestly, that's something that's usually worked out best in a therapeutic relationship. So being sexually assaulted or having sexual trauma, that is a relational thing. And we didn't want that relationship forced upon us, right? But that's the problem. We often have these wounds in relationships, and then what do? We recoil away from relationships. So it's not to say that you should recoil away from relationships, but now you need to have a healing relationship and a healing experience. Sometimes that doesn't mean a sexual experience. It doesn't mean having a healing sexual experience. It might mean having a healing relationship with the therapist, right? We call it the therapeutic relationship. So you need to have some trust and some safety restored. That is so key. When we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? There's a triangle where at the base of that triangle is safety. You can't get to self-actualization and pleasure and all of those other things. That's climbing the triangle. You don't get there without safety. So the first and foremost thing is safety, and that is often found by having a safe relationship that you can depend on.
And if you're the partner of a person that has experienced sexual assault, trauma, rape, you're going to have to understand that whether they have been medicated, whether they've had therapy and it's worked, it may be something that will continue to come up in some way for the rest of their life. That's just the natural progression of trauma. It's something that they may have to deal with. And you have to understand, if you're the partner of that person, you're going to have grace, extend patience. It's not you. They're not putting that on you. It's not your fault. It's not something that you have to apologize for or pay for, but it is something that you're going to have to, if you're going to be in that committed relationship, it is going to be something that you're going to have to be very, very patient. You have to at all times provide that safe space that Dr. Knight mentioned. It has to be a safe space. It has to be open communication. You have to be very aware of the no and the pulling back and the shutting down. It's not you, it's something that has happened to them. You have to be aware of that, and you have to immediately cut it off. As hard as it may be, as frustrating as it may be, you have to make sure that you don't recreate or introduce that trauma if you're the partner of that person.
And I think it's also very important, and I want to just ask you to sort of expand on this, on the male side of this, Dr. O'Rourke. It's not just traumatic sexual experiences with women, but also in the space that I deal in. My research was in male victims of sexual assault. There are traumatic experiences, and it presents itself differently. That a good amount of those men who are sexually aggressive and sexually predatory have experienced some amount of trauma, and they instead of recoiling, it created aggression in them. And so, Jason, just talk a little bit about that, so that we understand that there are realities on both gender sides as it relates to sexual trauma.
Thank you. Well, when I got molested, I was 6. It was a friend of the family, and what I realized now is that I was never sexually aggressive. But I was very, very angry all the time. From 6 forward, I was angry. My mother will tell you, my brother, my father, I was raging. And then things continued to happen, not to me, but later on in the family. So you had trauma, compounded on trauma. But you deal with this anger, and at least for me as a man, because I got molested by a man, my question was, what was it about me that made him think that was how I was supposed to function? And that's where I took it internally. And so when I was when I was 12, and from 12, starting at age 12, I did 500 push-ups a night. I did 40 pull-ups a day, and I couldn't talk, but Dr. Robert, he mentioned communication. I could not talk. I didn't have the communication skills. I was angry, and so my mother knew it. She thought about putting me into karate, but realized that was a jail sentence. And so she put me in football, and all of my peers knew that I played angry. I was the strongest little kid at age 12 playing football. And by the time I was a freshman in high school, I was bench pressing 300 pounds. I was deadlifting and squatting 5 because I was determined to never be injured like that again. I was determined. I was going to be the strongest, meanest thing going because no one was ever going to hurt me again, period. And so my life, and I made my mistakes. I have no, I was promiscuous. I make no hiding about that. I don't brag it. It was just a reality because part of it was the enculturation that I received. Part of it was wanting to be wanted, okay, in the way that I was taught I should be wanted, right? So for me, being raised an Adventist, being molested by a male, I should not be wanted that way. For me, being raised as an Adventist. So I began to act out, okay? I started, I had girlfriends and women and whatever, and then you have the porn thing. Why? Because I want to be wanted by the